So it is time then for the press preview, our first look at what is on the front pages. And tonight we'll see what's making the headlines with the broadcaster and former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng and Financial Times political correspondent Jasmine Cameron Qureshi. Very good evening to both of you. We'll speak in a moment after we've had a look at those front pages for you, beginning with the front page of The Observer, quoting senior Tories who fear a return to Boris as PM would risk the Conservative Party's death. While the Sunday Times reports that the right of the party has spurned Boris and claims support for Rishi is surging ahead. It's a different view from the Sunday Express, the paper saying that Boris Johnson is on track to pull off what it calls the biggest comeback in political history. The Sunday Mirror claims that the Tories are unable to govern themselves. Deal or no deal is the Sun on Sunday's headline, the paper claiming Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson could be working on a plan which would see one of them become PM. And the Sunday Telegraph also claiming that the two leading contenders are being urged to strike a deal to avert what it calls a Conservative civil war. And we're joined by Anita and Jasmine. Great to see you this Sunday evening. Just one story in town, just one story on the front of all the papers, as you'd expect. Jasmine, why don't you kick things off for us? The Sunday Express picturing there Boris Johnson as he got off that plane from the Caribbean. And as they say, Boris Johnson is on course to pull off the biggest comeback in political history. Is he on course to do that, Jasmine?
I mean, it's quite a triumphant headline from the Daily Express, a little bit preemptive. I mean, Boris Johnson's supporters have argued that he's reached the threshold of 100 MPs who are willing to back him. But obviously, you know, some of those MPs have come out publicly. I think there's about more than 50, but then some of those MPs are presumably keeping their cards close to their chest. What is interesting is that Johnson actually hasn't come out and said explicitly that he's running. He seems to be sort of trying to get a sense of where the mood is in the party, where the mood is in the membership, and is trying to figure out how to really play things. If we think back to July when he stood down, there was always that sense that he had said goodbye, but it wasn't really a permanent goodbye, and he'd be holding out for the next opportunity to get back into the fray, and perhaps this is his opportunity. But I think it's going to be quite interesting how the rest of the party navigates the return of potential another Boris Johnson premiership. Obviously, he's a pretty divisive figure, and if you think back to how many ministers and junior ministers resigned, saying that they had lost confidence in his leadership, it's questionable as to whether he is the individual at this time to really unite the party.
Yeah, Anita, just looking at the front page of The Observer, there were those rather slightly odd photographs, I thought, today, of Boris Johnson on the phone. There he is, looking a bit miserable with his thumbs up, though, speaking to an MP, presumably trying to canvass support. But The Observer saying that top Tories say that his return would risk the party's death, put it into a death spiral.
Yes, and actually this is sort of gets at some of those tensions and things that I'm sure Boris Johnson is weighing up as he comes into almost sort of the final day before it's time to start submitting your nomination paper. So I imagine that Boris Johnson hasn't entirely made up his mind, that really is going to depend on whether he gets those numbers. Now, there is some sort of different rumours swirling about in the papers tonight about whether or not Boris Johnson has in fact reached that threshold. What we can say is that 54 or 55 MPs have publicly said they are backing Boris Johnson. I slightly wonder whether if 100 had been reached, so few would be saying that they had backed him publicly, because it seems like the nomination paper will be, verified and seen by the 1922 committee on Monday in any case. But the key thing is his supporters seem to have heart to think that he is at the threshold, and that really the battle between Sunak and Johnson will be fought all of tomorrow and into Monday.
Yeah, time is running out, though, isn't it, Jasmine? And of course, Boris Johnson has to weigh up he has to weigh up a lot of things, but particularly the fact that he faces the Privileges Committee. And does he really want to be Prime Minister when he's got to go through that grilling and potentially be suspended as a result of it? And also, many Conservative MPs, or certainly several publicly, are threatening to resign if he does become PM.
Yeah, so I think one of the big problems that Johnson has is that he carries a lot of political baggage that comes with, having been a prime minister that's had to resign. So there's concerns about the Privileges Committee, and we heard from Dominic Raab over the weekend, who said, essentially, how can Johnson have any form of credibility when he's got this hanging over his head? And I think there's a real fear from Tory MPs that if Johnson is returned back into office while this Privileges Committee is taking place, it will really bring the party back to those dark days of Partygate and all those questions about what was in the Sue Gray report and what was said where and when and whether or not he lied to Parliament. And actually, I don't really think there's any political appetite for that. People are worried about paying for their energy bills. They're worried about rising mortgages. And actually, it probably wouldn't be a good look for the party to be embroiled in that affair again. There are also other things looming, such as the COVID inquiry, which will obviously shed light on Johnson's leadership during the pandemic. So there's a lot of issues that Tory MPs are weighing up, that Johnson will have to weigh up. And I think what's really striking is that a lot of MPs genuinely blame Johnson for, damaging the reputation of the party. If we think back to a couple of months ago, all of the by-election losses that were sustained under Johnson's watch. So there is a lot of scepticism in the backbenches. And I think people are asking themselves, why would Johnson want to be PM? Is it to genuinely, is it in the interests of the UK? Is there a sense of duty that he feels? Or is it more of a sort of personal ambition of his to perhaps finish business that he considered unfinished? And so they're weighing up all these questions at the moment.
Yeah, and the front page of The Mirror, the Tories can't even govern themselves, Anita. Critics accusing him already of lying, going back to what you were talking about earlier, whether or not he has got 100 MPs supporting him. Another blow for Boris Johnson is that people like Sajid Javid, Dominic Raab, Kemi Badenoch are all put their names behind Rishi Sunak.
Yes, I mean, the first two won't be a surprise, but, and Kemi, during the leadership contest over the summer, you could see signs that she was compelled by Sunak's arguments. But again, I mean, people like Charles Moore in The Telegraph earlier today, a big backer of Boris Johnson saying that now is not the moment. Lord David Frost, again, coming out and saying, actually, the moment is for Sunak and not Johnson. I think it's interesting. I probably slightly disagree with you, Jasmine, that the primary consideration will be things like the COVID inquiry, for instance. I think for Boris Johnson, he will not want to fight if he does not win. And I think that could, being a former prime minister and standing to be prime minister again, to lose that would be quite a big moment and a kind of big, almost the relationship and the emotional relationship that many MPs and party members have to Boris Johnson is in part because of the tremendous victory of 2019, but also because of the manner of his removal. And if there is a contest and it's a straight fight and Boris Johnson does not triumph, I think that becomes incredibly challenging for him and his sort of legacy within the Conservative Party. And there's also the challenge, of course, of MP support, because there is a feeling amongst his supporters that if he goes to the membership, he will win. But the challenge then is, because you're going to have this indicative vote, that you may have a vote that sets out in black and white the number of MPs that do not prefer Boris Johnson as a first choice. Now, that could be upended by the membership. They can ignore that indicative vote, but nevertheless, it makes it very, very clear when it comes to managing the parliamentary party, just how many people would have preferred Boris Johnson not to return. So there's a lot to weigh up. And I think it's a lot about reputation as well, rather than about maybe some of the kind of policy challenges. Because for him, the big sell for Boris Johnson is electability and the ability to sort of defy gravity. And I think that's what a lot of MPs are looking for. But the practical elements of governing are going to be very challenging if he does triumph.
Yeah, it's all so intriguing, isn't it? And talking about that indicative vote, well, we may not even get to that stage, Jasmine, because there is talk that these two men, Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, are in talks, that they've been discussing the future, maybe even this evening or perhaps tomorrow as well. What is that deal going to be, do you think? How could they come to some sort of agreement?
I mean, I think it's very plausible that an agreement could take place. I mean, I think the problem for any new leader coming in at this point is that effectively the party is so divided. If we look back to what's happened over the past year, we had the beginning of the year, all the issues with Partygate, then there were concerns about harassment, then we had quite a bitter leadership election over the summer, where effectively the party has been torn into multiple different factions. And so essentially there seems to be some sort of a ploy between Johnson and Sunak that actually whoever it is, that they rally their supporters behind them. Because I think what is quite interesting is because of Johnson's win in 2019, the Tories have this huge parliamentary majority on paper, but actually, as Truss showed, that the leader doesn't actually have a working majority to get legislation and policies through Parliament. And so that will be, a key focus for whoever the next leader is, that actually they need to have MPs on side. They need to ensure that MPs are aligned with their vision of government, aligned with the direction in which they want to take the economy. And so it's inevitable that there will be some sort of backroom deals, an attempt to lure one supporter side to another to actually ensure that the Conservative Party can actually govern, whoever it is ends up leading.
Yeah, we may get more details tomorrow. Just 20 seconds, Anita, from you on this deal, the front of the Sun, deal or no deal, talking about high-stake talks.
I'm yet to properly discern what a deal means, because Boris Johnson has been Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak has been Chancellor. I think they would both concede that did not work particularly well. And so is Boris Johnson, would he therefore be offered Chancellor? I can't imagine him wanting that role. So I'm not sure what it really means. But I'm sort of slightly wondering whether one of them would want to be anything other than Prime Minister, given the senior roles that they've held.
Yeah.
Likewise, Penny Mordaunt, it's a different situation where she may, having a prominent deal and a conversation between her and Sunak or Johnson could be a nice unifying signal for the party.
Part two of the press preview. Anita and Jasmine still with us. Front of the Sunday Times, Jasmine. I mean, there is other news around, none of it particularly optimistic, I'm afraid. Cancer rates rise to 55 days.
Yeah, it's quite a striking story. And I think it's important to, as important as it is to talk about the state of the Conservative Party and what's, the ins and outs of Tory psychodrama, actually, this story is a reminder that there are some very real issues facing the country, notably the running of public services. And this actually comes at quite an interesting time, because we know that Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has essentially said that all departments, could be at the risk of facing cuts, and that includes the Department of Health. And actually, there are all sorts of questions as to whether the NHS can endure any more public sector cuts and how the NHS has been running at the moment, because we know that since the pandemic, that actually there have been several headlines, whether it's cancer waiting times or waiting times more generally, indicating that the service is really struggling to keep up with demand at the moment. And this story in the Sunday Times just exemplifies that.
Yeah, really depressing, this, Anita, isn't it? Just seeing here, the UK came 33rd out of 41 developed nations for cancer mortality in 2019, according to the OECD.
Yes, and really what we're seeing also is that the wait time on average in the UK is 55 days. So this is quite a long-standing challenge that the UK has experienced. So that 55 days is sort of a week longer than it was in 2020. So even sort of during the pandemic. And it's primarily, it seems, a shortage challenge that the NHS has been struggling with for quite a significant period of time, which has obviously been exacerbated both by pressures on the NHS and challenges, recruiting, retaining staff, and just further underpins the point that the challenges in the economy in the UK, and many of these things are being experienced across Europe too, are so acute that it's very difficult to see how the UK navigates a successful path out of them, especially in a moment where there is such sensitivity to the UK's public finances that there really isn't that level of flexibility that the government can provide around spending to different departments. And I certainly wouldn't wish to be Jeremy Hunt, who I believe, honestly, even with the new Prime Minister coming in, Jeremy Hunt has the toughest job in government right now, because he has a week in which to come up with the kinds of scales of cuts that are completely unprecedented. In 2010, George Osborne and David Cameron had to cut 24 billion. We're now talking about potentially 40 billion. Like, how is half such a sum to be found? I really think it's going to be an enormously difficult time for the UK and for different departments.
Yeah, which leads us on to a story in the Sunday Express, which is also actually health related, Jasmine, isn't it? Festive staff crisis on the high street this Christmas, but retailers are struggling to find shop workers, but they fear that record NHS waiting lists are partly to blame, simply because potential workers are too ill to get to work.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, actually, because it touches upon the fact that the UK has a lot of people, I think it runs up into the millions, who are off work due to long-term sickness. And obviously that links to the accessibility of NHS healthcare and how easy it is for people to see doctors and then get certain illnesses treated. And it speaks to the fact that actually, you know, all of this is interconnected. If we have a health service that is struggling to meet the demand, that does seep into the wider economy as a whole. And even this is one small example of stores that will be struggling to recruit during Christmas. But actually, some of the numbers quoted in the story are actually quite big, and it's saying that vacancies are running up to thousands. So actually, this could potentially be quite a tricky period for businesses who are already struggling with energy costs, who will already be trying to make sure that they can attempt to get a profit this year in quite a tricky economic period for us all.
OK, talking of tricky times ahead, Anita, we've just got 1 minute left to talk about schools and their concerns.
It's the same story, really. So the National Association of Head Teachers is saying that 9 out of 10 schools will be running out of cash. And Paul Whiteman, the General Secretary, says, you know, there are no easy fixes left in terms of the cuts that they would have to make would start affecting things like staffing levels. And I think, you know, no easy fixes left is almost Jeremy Hunt's motto too. And I think it would be the exact same situation that Labour would be facing were they in power. Really, there's no low-hanging fruit that I'm aware of left across every department in government, and yet every department in government is going to need to be able to find savings.
OK, your challenge for the next hour to find something a little bit more cheerful to finish the day with. Anita, Jasmine, thank you both very much indeed for your thoughts on all those stories.